Close your eyes for a moment and imagine standing on a January afternoon in 1919. Children's laughter echoes off tenement walls as they play in the narrow streets. Workers hurry home from the docks, their breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Everything seems ordinary, safe, predictable. But in just moments, this peaceful winter day would become one of the most surreal disasters in American history. A disaster so strange, so impossible sounding, that for decades afterward, people would struggle to believe it really happened. If you find peace in uncovering forgotten stories, if you'd like to wander further into history's hidden corridors with me, then I invite you to subscribe. Together we'll keep listening to the whispers of the past. Section 1. The historical backdrop. Picture Boston's North End in January of 1919. This ancient neighborhood, where revolutionaries once plotted against King George, had transformed into something entirely different. The narrow cobblestone streets that once echoed with the footsteps of Paul Revere now rang with the musical cadence of Italian voices. By 1919, the North End had become the most densely populated neighborhood in all of America. Imagine, over 28,000 people crammed into just 1/3 of a square mile. Families of 8 or 10 sharing 3-room tenements. Children playing in alleyways so narrow that laundry lines stretched like prayer flags between opposing windows, blocking out much of the winter sky. The smell of garlic and basil drifted from countless kitchens. Old men played cards on wooden crates outside corner groceries. Mothers called to their children in rapid Italian, their voices creating a symphony of home in this new world. But this was not just any winter. This was the winter when the Great War was finally ending, and America was drunk on industrial prosperity. The war's sweet profits. World War I had turned molasses into liquid gold. Every artillery shell, every stick of dynamite, every explosive device needed to fuel the war machine required industrial alcohol. And molasses, that thick, dark syrup shipped up from the Caribbean, was the key ingredient in this deadly alchemy. Boston had become America's distilling capital. Ships arrived daily from Puerto Rico and the West Indies, their holds heavy with barrels of sticky sweetness. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company, known locally as USIA, had built an empire on this wartime demand. Picture the harbor on those winter mornings, steam rising from the water, the distant sound of ship horns, and the sweet, cloying smell of molasses carried on the salt wind. It was the smell of prosperity, of American industry triumphant. But there was urgency in the air too, a desperate race against time. The race against Prohibition. January 16th, 1920, just one day after our story takes place, Prohibition would become the law of the land. The manufacture and sale of alcohol would be banned across America. For companies like USIA, this meant only one thing: process every drop of molasses as quickly as possible before the law changed everything forever. Speed had become more important than safety, profits more crucial than precaution, and in the North End, towering over the tenements like a sleeping giant, stood the instrument of their ambition, a massive steel tank, 50 feet tall, holding 2.3 million gallons of molasses. The residents of the North End lived in its shadow every day. Children played in its shade. Mothers hung laundry where its bulk blocked the morning sun. They had grown accustomed to its presence, the way one grows accustomed to a mountain or a church steeple. They had no idea that this industrial monument was slowly, quietly, preparing to become their destroyer. Section 2. Daily Life and Characters. Voices from the Tenements. Let me take you inside the lives of the people who called the North End home. These were not just statistics or newspaper headlines. These were human beings with dreams, with families, with small daily rituals that made life beautiful even in the most crowded quarters. Maria D'Estacio was 10 years old. Every day after school, she would walk with her friend Pasquale Iantosca to collect pieces of wood for the family stove. Winter fuel was expensive, and every scrap of discarded lumber was precious. Can you picture them? 2 children, breath visible in the cold air, laughing as they gathered sticks in wooden crates, their small hands red with cold, but their hearts warm with the importance of helping their families. They had no way of knowing that January 15th would be the last day they would ever walk home together. Just a few blocks away at the Boston Fire Department's Engine 31, George Lay was finally getting some rest. He had worked the night shift, responding to calls through the freezing January darkness. Now, as the afternoon sun slanted through the firehouse windows, he lay down for a well-earned sleep. George was a man who spent his life running toward danger to save others. He understood risk, understood how quickly safety could turn to peril. But even he could never have imagined the nature of the danger that was about to engulf him. The language of survival. Walk through the North End streets with me for a moment. Listen to the voices. Most conversations happen in Italian. Mothers called to children, "Vieni qui, bambino." Shopkeepers greeted customers, "Buongiorno, come sta?" Old men debated politics with passionate gestures, their words flowing like music through the winter air. This was a community held together by language, by shared memories of the old country, by the gentle rhythms of tradition transplanted to new soil. But this linguistic richness would soon become a cruel disadvantage. When crisis struck, when rescue workers shouted instructions in English, when survival depended on understanding split-second commands, many would find themselves trapped not just by circumstances, but by the barrier of language itself. Children and sweet treasure. Here's a detail that will break your heart. Local children had turned the giant molasses tank into an unexpected source of joy. The tank leaked. Small streams of golden molasses would seep through the steel walls and drip onto the ground. The children discovered this sweet treasure. They would bring small pails and buckets, collecting the free molasses to take home to their mothers. Can you imagine their delight? In families where every penny mattered, where sugar was a luxury, this unexpected sweetness was like finding gold in the streets. They had no idea that these innocent drips were warning signs, that the leaking molasses was evidence of a structure under tremendous, impossible stress. The company knew, though. When neighbors complained about the leaks, USIA didn't fix the problem. Instead, they painted the tank, changed it from blue to brown, not to strengthen it, but simply to camouflage the evidence of its weakness. The immigrant dream under pressure. These families had come to America carrying hope in their hearts. They had left behind the familiar hills of Sicily, the olive groves of Calabria, the narrow streets of Naples, all in pursuit of something better for their children. They worked in the docks, in the factories, in the kitchens of America's industrial machine. They sent money back to the old country. They learned English in night schools. They planted small gardens in whatever soil they could find, coaxing tomatoes and basil to grow in the shadow of steel and concrete. But the American dream had placed them in harm's way. The cheapest housing, the most crowded neighborhoods, the areas where industrial dangers loomed largest. This was where newcomers could afford to live. They trusted that America's prosperity, America's industrial might, came with American safety standards. They believed that the massive tank towering over their homes had been built with American engineering precision. They were tragically, fatally wrong. Section 3. The Buildup. The tank that should never have been. Let me tell you about the most dangerous structure in Boston. A monument to corporate negligence so shocking that when modern engineers analyze it, they can barely believe it was ever built. The man responsible for designing this 2.3 million-gallon container was not an engineer. He was Arthur Gell, a company clerk with no training in structural design, no understanding of metallurgy, no knowledge of the immense forces that molasses could exert against steel walls. Imagine, you wouldn't trust a clerk to design your house. You wouldn't ask an office worker to build your car. Yet USIA entrusted this man with creating a structure that would hold the weight of nearly 3 million gallons of one of nature's densest liquids. The results were predictable and deadly. Engineering sins. Modern analysis reveals the tank's fatal flaws with mathematical precision. The steel walls were exactly half as thick as they should have been. Even by 1915 standards, forget modern safety requirements. This tank was a death trap, but the company made it worse. They skipped the standard water pressure test. This simple procedure, filling the tank with water to ensure it could handle the pressure, could have revealed the fatal weaknesses. Instead, they filled it directly with molasses, eager to start making profits. Time was money, safety was expensive, and the people living in the shadow of corporate greed would pay the ultimate price. Warning signs ignored. The tank spoke its distress in a language anyone could have understood. It groaned, it creaked, it leaked continuously. The rivets holding the steel plates together were under such strain that they popped out like champagne corks. Workers reported these problems. Neighbors complained. The evidence was visible, audible, undeniable. But the company executives were not listening to workers. They were not living in the North End. They were comfortable in their offices, counting profits from a safe distance. When the concerns grew too loud to ignore, USIA's response was revealing. They blamed sabotage. Italian anarchists, they claimed, were trying to damage American industry. The leaks, the structural problems, the obvious signs of impending failure, all of this was supposedly the work of foreign agitators. It was easier to scapegoat immigrants than to admit corporate negligence. The physics of pending doom. January 1919 brought an unusual warm spell to Boston. For several days, temperatures rose into the 40s, unusually warm for the middle of winter. The molasses in the tank, which had been shipped from the warm Caribbean, began to heat up. Here's where the science becomes terrifying. Molasses expands when heated, significantly. The warming weather increased the pressure inside that already weakened tank beyond its breaking point. But the residents of the North End knew nothing of thermal expansion. They knew nothing of metallurgy or structural engineering. They simply enjoyed the unusual warmth, grateful for a break from winter's harsh grip. On January 15, 1919, the temperature reached 43 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the tank, 2.3 million gallons of molasses pressed against steel walls that could no longer contain them. The stage was set, the actors were in place, and the curtain was about to rise on one of history's most surreal tragedies. Section 4. The event that changed everything. 12:30 p.m. The sound of steel surrendering. It began with a sound, not the explosion you might expect, not the dramatic crash of Hollywood disasters. Instead, witnesses described it as a series of sharp reports like giant rivets popping, like the hull of a great ship splitting apart. Then came a sound unlike anything anyone had ever heard before, the metallic shriek of steel plates tearing away from their moorings, followed immediately by something that defied all logic, the roar of liquid thunder. At exactly 12:30 on that warm January afternoon, the massive molasses tank simply surrendered. 50 feet of steel structure collapsed in seconds, unleashing 2.3 million gallons of molasses in a wave 30 feet high. Picture this if you can. A wall of brown liquid, taller than a two-story building, moving at 35 miles per hour through the narrow streets of the North End. This was not the slow as molasses of common expression. This was a tsunami of sweetness, a biblical flood of sticky destruction. The physics of impossible destruction. Let me help you understand what 2.3 million gallons means. That's enough liquid to fill nearly 4 Olympic swimming pools. But this wasn't water. Molasses is 1.4 times denser than water, which means this wave carried the destructive force of nearly 6 million gallons of water. The wave moved with the physics of a gravity current, its density giving it a momentum that could crush steel, topple buildings, and sweep away everything in its path. Horses and wagons vanished beneath the brown flood. Trucks were tossed like toys. Railroad cars were knocked clean off their tracks. But the most heartbreaking physics was yet to come. Human stories in the wave. Anthony DeStasio was 11 years old when the wave caught him. Decades later, he would describe the experience with the clarity that only trauma can provide. I was lifted up by the wave and carried, as if I was surfing. I rode on the crest of that wave of molasses. Imagine an 11-year-old boy, carried along on a river of destruction, somehow managing to stay on top of the deadly flood that was swallowing his entire world. He survived. Others were not so fortunate. Martin Cloherty was working near the waterfront when the wave struck. The molasses caught him, lifted him, tumbled him in its brown embrace. When he finally surfaced, gasping and confused, his first thought was that he had fallen overboard from a ship. The molasses was so thick, so encompassing, that his mind couldn't process what had actually happened. He thought he was drowning in Boston Harbor, not realizing that he was trapped in an industrial disaster beyond anyone's imagination. The Firehouse Tragedy. George Lay, the fireman we met earlier, never had a chance to wake up properly. The molasses wave struck Engine Company 31's firehouse with the force of a wrecking ball. The building collapsed instantly, trapping George beneath tons of rubble and molasses. Here was a man who had spent his entire career rescuing others from fires, from accidents, from all the dangers that city life could produce. Yet he died in his own firehouse, overcome by a disaster so unprecedented that no training could have prepared him for it. The children we can never forget, Maria D'Estasio and Pasquale Iantosca, those 10-year-old friends collecting firewood, were walking near the tank when it collapsed. The wave caught them instantly. Two children who had been laughing together, planning their evening chores, thinking about dinner with their families, were swept away in seconds. Their bodies were found days later, small forms embraced by the hardened molasses that had become their tomb. I want you to remember their names. Maria D'Estasio, Pasquale Iantosca. They were not statistics. They were children with dreams, with favorite games, with mothers who loved them. They deserved to grow up. The cold trap. But the wave itself was only the beginning of the horror. As the January afternoon progressed, as the warm weather gave way to winter's return, the molasses began to cool. And as it cooled, its viscosity increased dramatically. What had been a flowing liquid became increasingly thick, sticky, imprisoning. People who had initially survived the wave found themselves trapped in what was essentially organic concrete. Rescue workers could hear voices calling for help from beneath the hardening molasses. They could see hands reaching up through the brown mass. But as the hours passed, as the temperature dropped, the molasses set like cement around anyone trapped within it. Time became the enemy. Every passing minute made rescue more difficult, made survival less likely. The physics that had created the disaster were now ensuring its deadliness. Section 5. Legacies and Consequences. The heroes who ran toward hell. Within 5 minutes of the tank's collapse, the first rescuers arrived. 116 Navy cadets from the USS Nantucket, docked nearby for training exercises, rushed to the scene. Picture these young men, barely out of their teens, faced with a disaster beyond comprehension. They had trained for naval combat, for rescues at sea, but nothing had prepared them for this, a neighborhood drowning in industrial syrup. These cadets became heroes that day. They waded into the sticky morass, risking their own lives to pull survivors from the hardening molasses. They worked with their bare hands, with whatever tools they could find, racing against time and temperature. But they quickly discovered that conventional rescue methods were useless. The molasses clung to everything: clothing, skin, rope, ladders. Traditional tools became trapped in the sticky mass. New solutions had to be improvised on the spot. Then someone made a crucial discovery. Salt water could dissolve the molasses. The science of salvation. Boston Harbor became the key to rescue. Fire engines pumped seawater from the bay, spraying it onto the hardening molasses to break down its molecular bonds. What had seemed like an impossible material, harder than concrete, stickier than glue, began to soften and flow away. But the cleanup would take months. Boston Harbor turned brown with dissolved molasses. For weeks afterward, the entire waterfront smelled of sweetness. Ships had to navigate through sticky, syrupy water. Marine life disappeared from the affected areas. The most heartbreaking aspect of the rescue effort was the horses. Dozens of workhorses had been caught in the molasses wave. These massive, powerful animals, the trucks and taxis of 1919, were completely helpless against the sticky trap. Many had to be shot where they stood. There was simply no way to extract them alive from the hardening molasses. The sound of gunshots echoed through the north end as rescue workers performed this grim mercy. The legal revolution. The immediate aftermath brought something unprecedented in American law. The first major class action lawsuit in the nation's history. 119 separate legal cases were consolidated into a single, massive proceeding that would drag on for 6 years. The legal proceedings became a theater of corporate accountability. 3,000 witnesses testified. Engineers, metallurgists, and safety experts dissected every aspect of the tank's construction. The evidence was overwhelming, damning, undeniable. Hugh Ogden, a member of the Old North Church and the court-appointed auditor, spent years investigating USIA's negligence. His final report became a masterpiece of forensic engineering, documenting with scientific precision exactly how corporate greed had led to mass death. In 1925, the company was ordered to pay $628,000 in damages. equivalent to over $10 million today. More importantly, the case established legal precedent for corporate responsibility in industrial disasters. Never again could a company simply blame sabotage or act of God when their negligence killed innocent people. The birth of modern safety. The molasses flood changed American industry forever. Building codes were rewritten. Professional engineering licenses became mandatory. The casual attitude toward industrial safety, the idea that profits mattered more than precaution, died in the brown streets of the North End. Engineers today study the molasses flood as a foundational case in professional ethics. The disaster appears in textbooks, in safety training programs, in discussions about corporate responsibility. Those 21 deaths became the foundation for safety standards that have saved countless thousands of lives. But perhaps the most important legacy was the principle it established, that immigrant communities, that working-class neighborhoods, that the poorest and most vulnerable members of society deserve the same safety protections as the wealthy. The North End's tragedy became America's awakening. The final victim. 4 months after the flood, Boston Harbor gave up its last secret. Cesare Nicolo's body was found beneath a wharf, still trapped in the hardened molasses that had become his tomb. He was the 21st and final direct victim of the disaster, a man who had crossed an ocean seeking opportunity in America, only to become a casualty of America's industrial recklessness. His discovery marked the end of the immediate tragedy, but the beginning of a longer reckoning with what it meant to build a truly safe society. Section 6. Meaning and Human Reflection. The smell of memory. For decades after the flood, Boston residents claimed they could smell molasses on hot summer days. Scientists insisted this was impossible, that all traces of the disaster had been cleaned away long ago. But memory has its own chemistry. Trauma leaves scents in the air that only the heart can detect. Perhaps what people were smelling was not molasses at all, but the lingering presence of a community's grief, a neighborhood's lost innocence. The North End rebuilt itself, as communities always do after tragedy. New buildings rose where the old ones had been crushed. Children played again in streets that had once run brown with death. Life, with its remarkable resilience, found ways to continue, but something had changed forever. The easy trust in American industrial might, the assumption that progress automatically meant safety, the belief that corporate promises could be taken at face value. All of this died on January 15, 1919. Lessons written in molasses. What does the molasses flood teach us about the human condition? What wisdom can we extract from this strange and terrible tragedy? First, it reminds us that the powerless bear the cost of the powerful's mistakes. The executives who cut corners live far from the North End. The engineers who should have calculated stress loads were never in danger from their own negligence. It was Maria and Pasquale, George and Cesare, ordinary people pursuing ordinary dreams, who paid with their lives. Second, it shows us the true meaning of heroism. Those Navy cadets who ran toward danger, the rescue workers who risked their own lives in the sticky darkness, the neighbors who pulled survivors from the hardening molasses. They remind us that in our worst moments, human compassion shines brightest. Third, it demonstrates the power of seeking justice. Hugh Ogden's methodical investigation, the lawyers who fought for 6 years, the witnesses who testified to the truth, they prove that even the mightiest corporations can be held accountable when ordinary people refuse to accept injustice. The weight of prevention. Perhaps most importantly, the molasses flood teaches us about the mathematics of tragedy. 21 people died because a company clerk designed a tank he wasn't qualified to build. But how many thousands have lived because the building codes that emerged from this disaster prevented similar tragedies? We cannot resurrect Maria and Pasquale. We cannot bring George Leahy home to his family. We cannot undo the grief that shattered the North End on that January afternoon. But we can honor their memory by ensuring their deaths were not meaningless. Every time a building inspector checks structural integrity, every time an engineer calculates safety margins, every time regulations protect the vulnerable from corporate negligence, the victims of the molasses flood saved lives. Their tragedy became our protection. Their suffering became our wisdom. Their names, whispered in the wind that still blows through the North End, remind us that progress without precaution is not progress at all. Section 7. Perspectives and Echoes. The scientists who solved the mystery. Nearly a century after the disaster, students at Harvard University decided to solve the molasses flood's remaining mysteries. Using corn syrup and scale models, they recreated the physics of that January afternoon with remarkable precision. Their 2016 study confirmed what survivors had always claimed, that the initial wave really had moved at 35 miles per hour, that its height really had reached 30 feet, that the destruction really had been as total and swift as eyewitness accounts described. Science had finally caught up to memory. Mathematics had validated trauma. In 2014, metallurgical analysis revealed another piece of the puzzle. The tank's steel had contained insufficient manganese, making it brittle in cold weather. The January temperature fluctuations hadn't just increased pressure inside the tank, they had weakened the steel itself. Modern computational fluid dynamics has since modeled the exact flow patterns of that deadly wave. Scientists can now predict, with mathematical certainty, how the molasses moved through each street, around each building, claiming each victim. Technology has given us the tools to understand exactly what happened on that winter afternoon in 1919, but it cannot explain why it was allowed to happen in the first place. The community that remembers. Walk through the North End today, and you'll find a small plaque marking where the molasses tank once stood. It took Boston decades to install this modest memorial, a delay that speaks volumes about whose stories get remembered and whose get forgotten. The plaque is easy to miss. Tourists hurry past it on their way to Paul Revere's house, to the Old North Church, to the more comfortable stories of American heroism. Revolutionary history sells guidebooks. Industrial disasters make people uncomfortable. But the Italian-American families who still live in the North End carry the flood's memory in their bones. Grandchildren of survivors still tell the stories at family dinners. The names of the victims are spoken with the reverence usually reserved for saints. Maria Di Stasio, Pasquale Iantosca, George Laihe, Cesare Niccolo, and 17 others whose names deserve to be remembered alongside any American heroes. The writers who keep the story alive. The molasses flood has inspired novels, documentaries, children's books, and countless newspaper retrospectives. Each retelling adds new layers to our understanding, new perspectives on what it means to balance progress with responsibility. Some focus on the engineering failures, turning the disaster into a cautionary tale about professional competence. Others emphasize the social justice aspects, highlighting how environmental racism placed dangerous industries in immigrant neighborhoods. Still others celebrate the heroic response, the ordinary people who became extraordinary in their neighbor's darkest hour. All of these perspectives are true. All of them are necessary. The molasses flood was simultaneously an engineering disaster, a social justice catastrophe, and a testament to human resilience. It reminds us that history is not singular, but multiple. Not a single story, but a chorus of voices, each adding their own note to the larger symphony of human experience. The lesson that echoes forward. Today, when we hear about corporate shortcuts, about regulations being burdensome, about the need to prioritize business interests over safety concerns, the molasses flood whispers its warning across the decades. Every industrial accident that makes headlines, every building collapse, every chemical spill, every preventable tragedy carries echoes of that January afternoon, when corners were cut and lives were lost. The victims of the molasses flood speak to us still, not as ghosts haunting the past, but as guardians protecting the future. Their story is our inheritance, their tragedy, our responsibility, their memory, our moral compass, pointing toward a safer, more just world. The journey we've shared. We began this journey in the winter streets of 1919, walking alongside children gathering firewood, listening to the voices of Italian families building new lives in an old neighborhood. We witnessed the impossible, a tsunami of sweetness, a flood that moved like honey but struck with the force of concrete. We met heroes who ran toward danger, lawyers who fought for justice, survivors who carried memory forward through decades of silence and shame. We learned that history is not just dates and facts, but human hearts beating in distant times, human dreams interrupted by human failing, human love persisting even in the face of human tragedy. The molasses tank is long gone. The North End has been rebuilt, Boston Harbor runs clean and blue again. Even that legendary smell of molasses on hot summer days has finally faded from memory. If you wish to keep traveling through these quiet corridors of time, consider subscribing, not as a click of a button, but as joining a circle of listeners who believe that history still has stories worth telling. Stories of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. Stories of tragedy transformed into wisdom. Stories that remind us that we are all connected across the vast river of time by our shared humanity. Until we meet again in the whispers of the past, may you find peace in the stories that shaped us, wisdom in the voices that still speak to us, and hope in the knowledge that every ending is also a beginning.